Imagine yourself sitting in a waiting room. A door opens, and a voice calls your name. You walk in, and there he is, white coat, glasses, clipboard in hand. He smiles gently. Listens carefully. He prescribes a treatment, as questions, signs prescriptions. You thank him, say goodbye, and leave feeling hard, cared for. But, what if he told you this person was never a doctor? Not for a single day. Not even for a single class. What if he had lived this life for 20 years? Going in and out of hospitals, treating people, and being respected as a specialist. Tonight, with Kia and Cal, we are going to walk through this surreal story. And when it ends, you might never look at a badge, a white coat, or a title the same way again. He was ordinary. Too ordinary. So ordinary, he became invisible. Jean-Claude Roman was born in France in 1954. A peaceful childhood, loving parents, a quiet village. Nothing screamed danger. Nothing drew attention. But inside him, a kind of emptiness seemed to grow. And maybe it was in the silence of adolescence that he discovered something. People see what they want to see, and they believe what makes them feel safe. It was in that space between expectation and trust that he decided to invent a new version of himself. In the late 1970s, he told his parents and his wife that he had been accepted into medical school. Everyone was thrilled. The family swelled with pride. But the truth is that he never even took the entrance exam. And so began the construction of a lie. Brick by brick. With calm words, rehearsed gestures, and a carefully measured posture. For 5 years, he pretended to attend classes, pretended to take exams, and always had an excuse ready whenever someone asked for a document. He persuaded with the calm of someone who never had to raise his voice. And over time, even he began to believe he was a doctor. After the supposed graduation, he claimed to have been hired by the WHO, the World Health Organization. A noble role, distant, largely inaccessible to the public. It was the perfect disguise. No one dared to question him. After all, what kind of person would make up such a lie and sustain it for so long? Jean-Claude would wake up, dress like a doctor, and spend his days in libraries, parking lots, driving around aimlessly. At the end of the day, he would come home and speak of meetings, patients, reports, travels. A false routine, lived with precision. His children saw him as a hero. His wife loved him. His parents were proud. And he lied to them all, with a soft voice and a gentle smile. On the outside, a model man. On the inside, a bottomless well of secrets and anguish. And this charade would last 20 years. 20 long years, without a medical license, without a diploma, without registration. Just words, appearances, and silence. Silence that, for a long time, was enough. Not every lie is born with intent. Sometimes, it simply slips out, like a single drop that seems too small to cause any harm. But over time, it joins with others and floods everything. In the case of Jean-Claude Roman, the lie didn't begin as some grand, elaborate plan. It began with silence. It was 1975. He was just 21 when he told his family he'd been accepted to the University of Lyons Medical School. There was no celebration, just quiet smiles, restrained pride, a silent promise of a future. His parents believed him. His partner believed him. And perhaps, in that moment, he wanted to believe it too. But the truth is, Jean-Claude was never accepted into the university. He didn't attend a single class. He sat through no interviews. And yet, he continued playing the role of a student for years. Each morning, he left home as if heading to campus, crossed the city, and spent his days in libraries, public corridors, cafes near the university. He watched real students, listened in on conversations, jotted down professors' names. All of it to build a vocabulary that sounded legitimate. Words to protect his disguise. Phrases that felt real. At home, he shared stories he never lived. Spoke about lectures he never attended. Detailed, but neutral accounts. Without emotion, but with the precision of someone studying others. Over time, it became routine. And routine, as we know, has the power to normalize even the unreal. People stopped asking questions. He stopped inventing answers. And the space between truth and fiction was quietly filled with silence. That was the first step. No forged documents were needed. No accomplice. Just the willingness to maintain an unspoken gesture, to lie without saying, to deceive without promising, to be without truly being. And perhaps that kind of illusion is the most dangerous, because it has no edges, no clear beginning, and no point of return. Little by little, he realized he could keep going. And he did. He passed the first year, then the second, then the third. While his real classmates advanced through their studies, Jean-Claude advanced in his story. He invented fake exams, discussed technical subjects, referenced real terminology, anatomy, pharmacology, medical ethics. He listened more than he spoke, repeated more than he created. And with that, his lie gained details, layers, substance. If someone asked to see his notebook, he'd say he left it in his locker. If they wanted a copy of a test, he claimed the professor didn't allow it. If asked about internships, he said it was still too early. There was always an answer. Always gentle. Never defensive. The absence of confrontation was his armor. He never seemed offended, nor anxious, just calm, as if everything was perfectly in place. And that calmness was convincing. It's curious how we're taught to spot liars by their nervousness, their fidgeting, their darting eyes. But Jean-Claude was the opposite. Composed, quiet, controlled. And that was what made his lie so enduring. It didn't ask for attention. It didn't demand validation. It simply existed, like invisible vapor lingering in the air. Meanwhile, his family lived in the glow of a promising future. His mother, proud, spoke of her son the doctor. His father, quiet, carried admiration in his eyes. His partner, an unwitting accomplice, dreamed of stability. And Jean-Claude watched it all unfold, with a faint smile, and not a single truth. During those early years, he didn't practice medicine. He didn't prescribe anything. He didn't touch patients. Everything still lived in the realm of imagination. A fantasy that only took shape in conversations, in nighttime stories, in false memories told and retold. But even a quiet illusion, when fed daily, grows, and begins to take up space, to demand new steps, to ask for continuation. And that's how he took the next step. The fake graduation, the fake diploma, the fake job. Sometimes, the world really does seem to cooperate with those who lie, calmly, as if certain systems were asleep, as if no one truly expected anything to go that wrong, simply because everything looked too right. The environment Jean-Claude Ramin chose to build his lie in was like that. Perfect, vague, asleep. In 1980s Europe, verification systems were nothing like the digital rigor we know today. Bureaucracy lived on paper. Record requests were slow, and access to information was walled off behind institutional gates and official stamps. If someone claimed to be a doctor, all that was expected was that they looked the part. A lab coat, proper posture, the right vocabulary. Those were the unwritten credentials. Those were the records the eyes accepted. Jean-Claude understood this with rare intuition, and he used it to his advantage. His choice of an invisible role, researcher at the World Health Organization, was a masterstroke. The WHO, headquartered in Geneva, was distant to the average person. Respected, but inaccessible. Often in the news, but rarely in everyday life. It was the perfect disguise. No one really knew what happened inside. No one had direct contacts. No one imagined someone would pretend to belong to such a reputable international body. And so, he hid in plain sight, protected by the fog of a technical position, cloaked in supposed confidentiality. Whenever someone asked about his work, Jean-Claude said very little. He explained that the projects were classified, that they involved sensitive research, vaccine data, epidemics, international protocols, and that was enough. Not because he said too much, but because he held back. Because he delicately avoided hard questions. When in doubt, people prefer to trust, to believe what brings them peace. And that's what he offered. Steady speech, steady gaze, a prestigious name tied to science and health. No one dared ask for documents. No one questioned the truth behind his routine. After all, what reason would someone have to make up such a complex lie for so long? Without seeking fame, without hitting the headlines, without flaunting wealth? The absence of visible ambition was his camouflage. Jean-Claude didn't seek public office, didn't appear in newspapers, didn't speak at conferences. He only ever said he was just returning from something, a work trip, a technical meeting, a report no one could read, and everyone accepted it. The architecture of his life itself supported the illusion. He lived near the border between France and Switzerland, the perfect distance to justify long daily commutes to Geneva. He drove alone, left early, came home late, and in that space, doubt dissolved. His wife saw the car leave and return. His children saw him walk in, tired. His friends noted his punctuality and restraint. Everything about Jean-Claude pointed to a legitimate routine. Even his silence felt professional. In a world where proof was rarely demanded, the appearance of normality was the strongest credential. And in his case, normality was the most sophisticated disguise of all. The system's fragility was his invisible ally. There was no unified database to confirm whether he was a doctor or not. No one called the WHO to check his name, out of embarrassment or respect. His word was enough, and that might be the most unsettling part. It wasn't a brilliant plan that upheld the lie. It was the carelessness of daily life, the habit of trusting, the laziness of detail. We live in a web of assumptions, of small, unspoken agreements, where titles become truth, without anyone checking the foundation. Jean-Claude didn't create that web. He just realized it was there, and settled into it, like someone resting in a hammock strung between old trees. Meanwhile, time passed. Decades piled up, and no one suspected a thing. The environment, this world of no questions, no checks, no suspicion, was like a fog that covered every crack. A comfortable fog, welcoming, silent, and in that silence, the lie kept growing. There are people who speak little, but when they do, they seem to carry certainty. Jean-Claude Roman was like that. He had a quiet demeanor, a restrained presence, and a gaze that rarely wavered. He wasn't the kind of man who dazzled, but the kind who soothed, and that, at times, can be even more dangerous. He knew that appearance is a subtle kind of armor, and if carefully constructed, it can withstand any question. He was meticulous with the details. His haircut, always discreet. Thin-rimmed glasses, polished shoes, a barely noticeable cologne, a voice that never rose. He spoke slowly, like someone who thinks before speaking, avoided overusing technical terms, preferred simple words, but delivered them with confidence. He said only what was necessary, and let silence fill in the rest. He dressed as if he didn't want to stand out, and that was exactly what made him stand out. A crisp white coat, a tie in muted tones, a leather briefcase filled with papers no one ever saw. Everything about him looked medical. Not like a flashy doctor, but a real one. The kind who works behind the scenes, far from the spotlight. Who has no time for vanity. Who lives between diagnoses and hospital corridors. Even without a clinic, an office, or a receptionist. He had something far harder to acquire. The aura of credibility. And that aura can't be bought. It's built. Jean-Claude built it with patience. For years, he cultivated small gestures that, when combined, created the perfect illusion. He arrived punctually to appointments, held himself with composure at family dinners, quietly supported social causes, gave friends thoughtful advice for their aches and doubts. He spoke about vaccination campaigns, research progress, tropical diseases. Never too technical, but just enough to sound informed. And he always mentioned the World Health Organization, as if he were part of something greater. The WHO functioned like an invisible shield, a name so respected, it required no explanation. If someone asked about his work routine, Jean-Claude would sigh softly and say something like, "It's exhausting, but necessary." That vague, dignified answer was enough. Not because it revealed anything, but because it suggested everything. People, deep down, don't want details. They want reassurance. And Jean-Claude offered that with mastery. Even his children saw him as an admirable man. He drove them to school, attended their meetings, but kept a distant air, like someone carrying the burden of a demanding profession. He never raised his voice, never rushed, always seemed in control, and that control was hypnotic. No one saw him as an imposter, because he didn't act like someone trying to deceive. He acted like someone tired of living a difficult truth, and that kind of weariness convinces. To his family, he was a dedicated worker. To his friends, a model of stability. To the neighborhood, a quiet and respectable man. The absence of exaggeration made everything believable. There was no showing off, no seeking attention, no urge to impress. Jean-Claude didn't want to seem brilliant. He just wanted to seem real. And in that, he was brilliant. It's curious to think how the human mind responds to appearance. How a confident walk, a calm tone, a briefcase in hand, can be interpreted as signs of competence. We're trained to trust what presents itself naturally. And Jean-Claude was a specialist in that. Not in medicine, but in looking like a doctor. Perhaps he even began to believe the role himself. Maybe one day he looked in the mirror and forgot who he was. Because when a lie is sustained long enough, it begins to shape the body. Posture changes. Breathing changes. The eyes learn how to hold steady. And then, the act becomes habit. And habit becomes identity. Jean-Claude wasn't living a lie anymore. He was the lie. Not out of vanity, but out of addiction. And like every silent addiction, it grew unnoticed. Meanwhile, the world around him kept trusting, because everything about him said, "I'm trustworthy." His clothes, his speech, his gestures, and above all, his lack of noise. Jean-Claude was a man without scandals, without public debts, without visible arguments, and that, in a world driven by excess, is a powerful way to go unseen. For a long time, Jean-Claude Ramen was simply the doctor no one ever saw in action. The one who was always just coming back from work, always busy with reports, conferences, and behind-the-scenes meetings. But there were moments when his lie had to touch the real world. Moments when he couldn't just seem, he had to act. That's when the first consultations began. Not in hospitals, not in clinics, but in casual conversations, hallway encounters, late-night phone calls, or quiet confidences between friends. He didn't use a stethoscope, didn't perform clinical exams, but he gave advice. Advice that came with the authority of someone who knew what he was talking about, or at least knew how to seem like he did, and that was often enough. Once, a neighbor complained of back pain. Jean-Claude suggested stretching, warm compresses, and light physiotherapy. No medication, no risk. Another acquaintance called in a panic. Her son had a fever. He spoke calmly, said it was normal, probably viral, recommended hydration and observation, and the fever passed. And so, day after day, he accumulated small, invisible victories. The kind that reinforce people's trust and deepen the lie itself. They weren't formal appointments, but they were enough to cement the image of a reliable doctor. Approachable, present. He always avoided complex cases. If someone mentioned serious symptoms, Jean-Claude would gracefully back away. He'd say it wasn't his specialty, or that, ethically, he preferred not to get directly involved. That caution was strategic. It kept him safe, distant enough not to make mistakes, close enough to appear helpful. He orbited medicine, but never truly entered its atmosphere. He was a sun without gravity, shining, but untouchable. Even so, these small interactions built bonds of trust. Because, deep down, most people aren't looking for a diagnosis. They're looking for a calm presence, a voice that says, "Everything's going to be all right." And Jean-Claude delivered exactly that. It wasn't technical knowledge that sustained him. It was his ability to soothe. He knew that in moments of distress, tone is what heals most. A soft voice, a long breath, a presence that radiates stability, and in that he was effective. Over time, some friends started to turn to him more often, to talk about symptoms, to ask for opinions, to confirm what they'd read in a pamphlet or seen on TV. He became, little by little, a point of reference, someone you'd call before seeing a real doctor, someone who validated your worries, or calmly dismissed them. And why was that so dangerous? Because he was always right. Not because he mastered medicine, but because he knew where not to go wrong. His advice was always conservative. He never prescribed, never took risks, but he always spoke with confidence. That balance made it seem like he knew more than he showed, like an experienced doctor who no longer needed to prove anything. And once again, the environment played in his favor. No one recorded those conversations. No one took notes. No one, absolutely no one, imagined that Jean-Claude wasn't a doctor. The question simply didn't exist. To question his credentials would have seemed absurd, even offensive. Like asking a firefighter if he knows how to use a hose, or a pilot if he knows how to take off. His role was taken as fact, as part of the natural order of things. And that's why his small consultations were so powerful, not for their complexity, but for their confirmation. They confirmed the character he had created, helped sustain the quiet theater of his life. And the more he helped, the more he was remembered. And the more he was remembered, the more he was sought after. Without realizing it, people around him began shaping their own memories around him. They started telling stories that involved him, repeating phrases he'd said, seeing him as a reference. And Jean-Claude listened to all of it with care, because every word of admiration was another brick in the sandcastle he was building. And sandcastles, as we know, last only until the first wind. But until that wind arrived, he would go on saying what people needed to hear, go on avoiding risks, go on feeding the lie, with the same calm as always. Se quiser, passo agora gerar os 3 prompts de imagem para esse trecho, ou seguir com o tópico 5. O que prefere? Living 2 lives at once is an act of balance. It's like walking a tightrope stretched between the known and the invented. And Jean-Claude Roman knew that. He knew that at any moment he could misstep. During the day, he was the invisible doctor. He left early, dressed soberly, with a calm gaze and a rigid posture. He drove to the Swiss border, as if heading to an important job. But in reality, he spent hours in empty parking lots, in public libraries, or wandering aimlessly through the city. He turned the silence of those hours into a kind of protection. No one saw where he was, no one knew what he did. And so, his absence became his presence. A paradox only he could understand. At night, he returned home and assumed the role everyone expected. He was the devoted husband, the present father, the respected professional. He spoke of meetings that never happened, of trips he never took, of projects that didn't exist. His stories were full of generic details, just enough to hold interest, but never enough to invite deeper questions. He was a craftsman of words, weaving a web of partial truths and calculated silences. Yet this double life required energy, a constant effort to keep every piece in place, to ensure no suspicious glance appeared, to avoid any unexpected question that might leave him exposed. Jean-Claude learned to control his facial expressions, to keep his voice steady, to hide any sign of nervousness. He was a meticulous actor, performing the same role over and over, with repetition as his greatest ally. Inside, however, the weight of the lie was an invisible burden. The constant fear of being discovered quietly gnawed at his soul. But he couldn't show that. He couldn't falter. And so, he went on, staying steady on the invisible thread that separated truth from falsehood. Day after day, year after year, and most striking of all, no one noticed. Not the imaginary colleagues, not the family, not the neighbors. Because Jean-Claude's lie didn't need accomplices. It stood on its own, upheld by the absence of doubt. People didn't ask, didn't seek proof, didn't investigate. They accepted what he said because they wanted to believe, because trust is an act of courage. But this trust, built on quicksand, was fragile, and any wrong step could bring it all down. For now, though, Jean-Claude's double life continued, quietly, unhurried, like a heavy secret, carefully guarded. And the strange thing was that, even trapped in this web, he seemed to find a kind of comfort, a safe space within his own invention. Because sometimes, a lie isn't just an escape, it's a refuge. The life of an imposter is a constant balancing act. There's no fixed script. No amount of rehearsal can prepare for everything. You have to learn to dance with the unexpected, to adapt, to change your step mid-song. Jean-Claude Romme discovered this early on, because it wasn't enough to just pretend. You had to improvise. When someone asked an unexpected question, he didn't hesitate. He took a deep breath, chose his words carefully, and stitched together answers that sounded so natural. No one ever suspected the invisible thread holding them up. If someone asked for a document, he'd say it was stored at the office. If they inquired about a colleague, he spoke of someone who never existed, but whose name sounded just real enough. If they pressed for technical details, he would shift to generalities, change the subject, or offer a discreet joke. This ability to improvise became, for Jean-Claude, like breathing, a reflex that saved him from setbacks that could have been fatal. And the more he improvised, the more confident he became. It was as if the lie took on a life of its own, a shape-shifting creature adapting to each new situation. At times, he had to invent stories on the spot to justify absences, canceled trips, or prolonged meetings. He created fake reports, wrote letters that would never be sent, pretended to take work calls. He also kept a small circle of people to whom he could reveal controlled fragments of the lie. Nothing deep, just enough to maintain trust. Because he knew that amid so much improvisation, isolation could be his downfall. He needed allies, even if they were unaware. On the other hand, constant improvisation demanded vigilance. Any slip could raise doubts, any contradiction, suspicion, and that increased the weight he carried. the tension that sometimes threatened to leak through in involuntary gestures or uncomfortable silences. But he concealed it well, like a conductor guiding an invisible orchestra. He controlled each note, every pause, every chord. Jean-Claude's life, then, was one long improvisation, a continuous performance, with the script rewritten in every act. And what makes this story even more fascinating is that this improvisation didn't feel desperate. It felt natural, as if it were part of his very essence. This ability to invent responses, to mold reality with words and gestures, may have been his most valuable talent. Far more than any fake diploma or forged document. Because, deep down, he didn't need to be a doctor. He only needed to seem like one. And for that, improvisation was the key. Sometimes, what makes us believe in someone isn't just what they say, but how they present themselves. It's a subtle combination of gestures, expressions, and presence. Something we call charisma. Jean-Claude Roman possessed that charisma, albeit in a quiet way. He wasn't an extravagant man, nor someone who sought attention. But there was something in his calmness that inspired trust. His charisma wasn't a burst of energy, but a steady flame, small yet firm. It was the kind of presence that soothes a restless soul, making you lower your guard without even noticing. In his conversations, Jean-Claude mastered the art of silence. He knew when to speak and, above all, when to listen. And that balance created a sense of security, as if he were a calm harbor in the middle of a storm. People felt they could trust him, that he knew more than he said, that behind his measured words, there was knowledge and experience. That charisma was a crucial piece in keeping his deception alive for so long, because, at its core, trust is a choice. We choose to trust those who seem to have our best interests at heart. Jean-Claude offered exactly that. A serious demeanor, attentive listening, thoughtful advice. He wasn't an actor exaggerating or forcing emotions. He was someone who seemed authentic in his quiet dedication. That apparent authenticity was his shield. Because when someone believes in you, they rarely seek proof or question details. And so, he remained a respectable figure. A man walking between reality and imagination, using charisma as a bridge. It's intriguing to think that often, charisma is what holds fragile bridges together. That it can be more powerful than facts or documents. Jean-Claude knew this, and he used that silent weapon to keep his world intact. Even in the face of occasional doubts, his presence could dispel them, like a gentle breeze clearing away dark clouds. And so, the lie went on, not with violence or aggression, but with the softness of a calming gesture. Time, for all of us, is a river that never stops. It flows constantly, silently, relentlessly, and even when it seems like nothing changes, it keeps moving forward. For Jean-Claude Roman, the years were that silent river, decades passing without major events, but not because he didn't want change. On the contrary, but because the lie creates a kind of invisible prison. His life was a cycle of similar days, where everything seemed still, but nothing could really move. He hadn't graduated as a doctor, hadn't advanced in his career, hadn't progressed. But he hadn't fallen behind either. It was as if he were frozen in suspended time, between what could be and what really was. And that paradox is one of the strangest things about this story. While friends and colleagues earned diplomas, jobs, families, Jean-Claude remained there, between two worlds, belonging fully to neither. The illusion he created came with a high price, the sacrifice of the future. Every lie, every silence, every evasion was a chain that bound him, and the more time passed, the harder it was to break those chains. Inside, perhaps, he felt that anguish. But on the outside, he kept up the routine with the same studied calm. He was like a drifting boat, not knowing where it was going, but still floating. That state of stagnation made life feel like a never-ending play, where the script repeated without surprises. And still, the play had to go on, because stopping would mean facing the void. And the void was far too frightening. The silence that once was comforting now echoed, and that echo came in the form of doubts. Small cracks appearing in his mind. But those cracks weren't external. They didn't come from questions by family or friends. They were internal. The fear of being found out. The feeling that the lie could collapse at any moment. Yet still, he maintained the facade. Because routine is a powerful crutch. It supports what can't be supported for long. And time keeps passing. Lies have weight. Not always visible, not always immediate. But heavy, yes. A weight that silently accumulates, like water seeping through a wall. For Jean-Claude Ramen, that weight grew day by day. It wasn't just the stories he needed to keep alive. It was the details that had to fit together. The questions he avoided. The doubts he suppressed. At first, silence was an ally. The perfect hiding place. But as the years passed, that silence became a prison. Every lie told was one more stone in the burden he carried. Every absence justified one more step away from the truth. And the curious thing was that the weight didn't come from outside, not from the people around him. It came from himself, from the awareness that at any moment, everything could collapse. That awareness, even if subtle, made Jean-Claude live in a constant state of alert. A silent vigilance, almost a contained paranoia. He had to be perfect, or nearly so, because one slip, one contradiction, one suspicious look, could be fatal, and that need for perfection exhausted him. In his mind, the lie took on a life of its own, like a shadow growing behind a door, ready to appear at any moment. But despite that weight, he kept going, without pause, without rest. The farce was his world, his distorted truth. And that truth, no matter how false, shaped every step he took. It was a prison without visible bars. A cell made of unspoken words and empty promises. The weight of a lie grows, yes. And he learned that the hardest way. Lies have a strange way of spreading. They move silently, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow growing on the walls of a house. And often, it's not just the false facts that spread, but the trust these lies create. Jean-Claude Roman didn't just live his lie in silence. It began to take on a life of its own, reaching those around him. The trust people placed in him multiplied. The stories he told became the foundation for other stories. And thus, the deception wove itself into the fabric of everyday life. His family, friends, and acquaintances started to see him through the lens of the lie. Not as he really was, but as the carefully constructed image. And this image created a kind of invisible web. A network of expectations, beliefs, and memories that reinforced each other. People spoke of Jean-Claude with admiration. They commented on his work at the World Health Organization, spoke about his dedication to family, and celebrated the man who seemed to be an example of stability and responsibility. This web made it so no one suspected. Because when a lie becomes part of the shared narrative, questioning it means threatening the group's very reality. So silence perpetuated itself. And the lie, even as a fragile construction, gained strength in the unanimity of belief. And the most curious thing is that this spreading didn't depend on Jean-Claude. It was a natural side effect of the trust placed in him. He, in turn, fed this web with small actions. A gesture of attention here, a word of comfort there, and the cycle continued. But even wrapped in this web, the risk of collapse remained. Because lies that spread also attract questions. And unexpected questions. Jean-Claude knew he had to always be alert, always ready to sustain the story, to extinguish sparks of doubt before they became fires. And this constant care made his life a delicate act of balance. Small lies, almost imperceptible. They begin as whispers, silent, discreet. But over time, they become persistent voices, hard to silence. Jean-Claude Roman knew this, even if he couldn't admit it. Every evasion to dodge a question, every excuse to justify an absence, every invented detail to fill a silence. All of this left marks, invisible marks to others, but deep within him. Small lies, added together, create a complex web. And once this web is set, it demands constant maintenance. The price of these lies was not just the effort to keep them. It was also the growing distance from the truth itself, from the self. Jean-Claude got lost in what he created, leaving behind not only the education he never had, but also parts of his own essence. Every lie told was a seed of doubt planted in his heart. And over time, these doubts sprouted into loneliness. Because truth, no matter how harsh, is a solid foundation. While lies are a house of cards, beautiful but fragile. And in the silence of the night, when there was no longer an audience for his stories, Jean-Claude faced the weight of what he had built. The fear of being discovered, the silent guilt, the emptiness of someone living among shadows. The price of small lies is high, and often invisible to those who watch from the outside. But for those living this reality, the cost is immense. Every small lie demanded another to cover it. And so, the web expanded, and the prison closed in. Fear is a constant shadow in the life of someone living a lie. It has no form, no voice, but it's always present, lurking in the cracks of silence. For Jean-Claude Roman, the fear of being discovered was a silent, yet heavy presence. a weight he carried in every gesture, every word, every glance. It wasn't a loud fear, full of screams or outbursts. It was a subtle fear, almost a whisper, that said, asterisk, what if they find out? Asterisk. This thought followed him throughout the day, when he pretended to leave for work, when he avoided unexpected encounters, when he invented stories to fill the void. And at night as well, when the lights went out and the truth hid behind quiet walls. The fear of discovery wasn't just fear of other people's judgment. It was fear of the emptiness that would come with it, the collapse of the house of cards he had built, the inevitable confrontation with who he truly was. This fear shaped his actions. It made him plan every detail, revise every story, adjust every lie. It was a constant vigilance, a permanent state of alert. And even with all this caution, he knew the risk was real. That at any moment, a wrong word, a misstep, a coincidence, could reveal everything. That risk made his life a fragile thread, a delicate dance above an invisible abyss. But paradoxically, that same fear also pushed him to continue, to keep up the facade, to live the lie with calm and control, because giving up would mean facing the unknown, and the unknown was far too frightening. Personal relationships are delicate fabrics, woven from threads of trust, affection, and presence. When those threads are cut or entangled with lies, the fabric can weaken, developing invisible tears. For Jean-Claude Roman, the lie that sustained his identity also affected his closest connections. But unlike what one might expect, those relationships didn't collapse right away. They continued, often in a kind of silent suspension. His wife, his children, his family, his friends, all lived beside a man who, despite appearances, was not entirely who he seemed to be. Yet love, routine, and the desire to believe created a soft haze, enough to cover the cracks. But those cracks were there, subtle but real. Emotional distance, silence in certain moments, the glance that avoids another's eyes. All of these are echoes that resonate in the heart of a relationship. Jean-Claude, whether consciously or not, carried an invisible weight in his interactions with others. Because lying demands vigilance, caution, a constant rehearsal to avoid revealing the hidden truth. And that demand turns daily life into a quiet performance. He might have been physically present, but absent in essence. Present in body, but far away in spirit. And over time, that creates a deep loneliness. Even when surrounded by others, the imposter can feel utterly alone. Personal relationships, in this context, become a game of appearances and omissions, where truths are measured, revealed in fragments, never fully shared. And this dynamic affects not only the one who lies, but also those around them, who live with veiled doubt, with the quiet sense that something is being left unsaid. The impact, then, is silent, but no less real. Because in the end, trust is the foundation of every relationship. And when that foundation is built on lies, the future becomes uncertain. Every lie, no matter how carefully built, carries within it the risk of collapse. The mask we wear to hide who we truly are is never eternal. Over time, it begins to loosen, to show cracks. For Jean-Claude Ramen, that moment came slowly, like a quiet breath that hints at a coming storm. At first, it was small details. A question asked a little too persistently. An unexpected comment. A look that seemed to search beneath the surface. He dismissed them, redirected attention, invented new stories to fill in the gaps. But the cracks appeared, gradual, inevitable. The sense that something could be uncovered began to hover more often. And with it came the anxiety he had long tried to keep at bay. The mask, once secure, now felt heavier, like a tight garment that suffocates, that restricts natural movement. Jean-Claude began to realize that improvisation alone was no longer enough. He had to be prepared for the unexpected. His efforts to control the narrative demanded more energy, more attention to the smallest details, more constant vigilance. And that drained him, his calm, his strength, his courage. Perhaps the most delicate part was the awareness that those around him, even without knowing the full truth, had started to sense that something wasn't quite right. Maybe it was a glance that avoided another, an uncomfortable silence, a behavior that no longer made sense. These signs, however subtle, were like warnings. Small red lights blinking in the dark. And Jean-Claude knew that if he wasn't careful, the mask could fall completely. But still, he pressed on. He continued playing his role with studied calm, like an actor who remains on stage, even as he senses the curtain might drop at any moment. Even the strongest structures can collapse when their foundation is made of sand. And for Jean-Claude Ramen, that moment arrived like a whisper turning into a silent thunder. The collapse wasn't sudden. It was a slow process, almost imperceptible to those watching from the outside, but devastating to the one experiencing it from within. Small doubts began to grow within his family and close circle. Questions that were once easily deflected began to meet resistance. Stories that once seemed solid began to show flaws. Jean-Claude tried to hold things together. He reinforced the facade with greater care. But the weight of accumulated lies made the effort increasingly difficult. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The more he tried, the more truth slipped away. And the collapse began with small incidents. Forgotten details, unintentional contradictions, glances that no longer met. For Jean-Claude, it was a moment of intense internal conflict. The facade he had maintained for so long now threatened to fall apart, taking a part of him with it. It was like watching, in slow motion, the fall of a castle built with patience and fear. Behind that ruin was the fear of the unknown, of what would come after the mask fell. But perhaps, too, a strange feeling of relief. Because no matter how painful the fall, it also carries the possibility of a new beginning. When a lie that's been built over so much time finally collapses, the consequences aren't only external. They're also internal, deep, silent, and profound. It's as if an earthquake shakes not just the ground beneath our feet, but the soul itself. For Jean-Claude Ramen, the consequences were devastating. The facade that held up his identity crumbled, leaving the raw truth exposed. The bonds he had woven with fragile words were torn apart. Those who once trusted him now faced the shock of revelation. But beyond the reactions of others, the consequences reached into an even more delicate place: his own heart. What follows a lie that big? How does one live with guilt, regret, and emptiness? Jean-Claude saw his life turn into a mosaic of pain and confusion. Each fragment reflected a part of himself he had hidden, denied, or forgotten. And within that chaos, there was the heavy silence of loneliness. Because once the mask falls, it can no longer conceal. The consequences become unavoidable, and the road to rebuilding is long and winding. This part of the story reminds us that every lie comes with a price, and often, that price is far greater than we ever imagined. But it also invites us to reflect on the possibility of redemption, of learning from our mistakes, and seeking a new beginning. Historias como a de Jean-Claude Roman nos convidam a olhar para dentro, para pensar sobre as verdades que carregamos, as máscaras que usamos, e as sombras que evitamos. Ele vivo entre o real e o inventado, entre o amor e a mentira, entre o silêncio e o medo. Sua vida nos mostra que, por mais que tentemos esconder, a verdade sempre encontra seu caminho. Mas também nos lembra da complexidade humana, de que somos feitos de luz e escuridão, de força e fragilidade. Jean-Claude nos ensina que as escalas que fazemos tem peso, que a honestidade, mesmo que difícil, é caminho que traz leveza, e que, no fim, todos nos buscamos hacia taco e pertencimento. Seja através de verdade ou da ilusão. E ao ouvir essa história, talvez possamos refletir sobre as histórias que contamos para nós mesmos, e sobre a coragem necessária para sermos autênticos. Porque a vida, como todas as suas imperfeições, merece ser vivida sua verdade. Sem máscaras que pesam. Every story, no matter how strange or painful, carries a lesson, and the life of Jean-Claude Roman is no different. Behind the facade, the deception, and the years of carefully constructed lies, there is a quiet invitation. An invitation to look inward, with more attention and more compassion. Perhaps the greatest lesson lies in the complexity of the human condition, in how fear, insecurity, and the longing for acceptance can lead us down twisted paths. Jean-Claude tried to fill an emptiness with a fabricated image, a search for belonging, for respect, for love. But by hiding his truth, he became trapped in his own web. This story reminds us that honesty with ourselves is essential. That authenticity, even with its flaws, is a gift we offer to ourselves and to others. It also teaches us that judgment is often easy, but understanding is harder and more necessary. Jean-Claude isn't just a man who deceived the world. He is also a man who, in his weakness, reflects the vulnerability that lives in all of us. And that vulnerability, when embraced, can become a path toward healing and toward freedom. As we reflect on this lesson, we may allow ourselves to be gentler with our own imperfections, more patient with our fears. Because deep down, we are all seeking the same thing: to be seen, to be understood, and to be accepted. We've reached the end of this story that feels like a strange dream. The story of Jean-Claude Roman, the man who lived an entire life of lies, improvisations, and masks. It's natural to feel a mix of emotions while following this journey. Curiosity, surprise, sadness, and perhaps a hint of understanding. But more than anything, this story is an invitation. An invitation to look inward, to the truths we choose to hide, the masks we wear each day. We live in times where appearances often speak louder than essence, where the fear of judgment leads us to conceal parts of ourselves. Yet it's in embracing our own vulnerability that we find true freedom. It's in the courage to be authentic that we build real relationships, with more depth and more truth. May Jean-Claude's story remind us of this, that even in our darkest moments, there is always a possibility for a new beginning, and that, to sleep peacefully, we may need to let go not only of the lies told by others, but also the ones we tell ourselves. Now, allow your body to find comfort. Let your mind gently slow down, and may the silence of the night cradle your rest. Thank you for being here, for listening, for reflecting. Until the next night, where new stories and truths will come to soothe and surround. Good night.